everyone. Good evening. My name is Alex Bogby, and I'm a member of the faculty here at the Courtauld. And I'm standing in for my colleague Jessica Barker, who unfortunately can't be here because she is looking after her feverish 2-year-old. But this gives me a chance not only to say thank you to Jessica for organizing this event, but also to congratulate her on the opening last Friday of an exhibition at the Sainsbury Centre at the University of East Anglia in Norwich called Living by the Rule, Contemporary Art and the Medieval Monastery. I think some of you have already seen it. Make a small sound if you've already seen it. Yeah, so the rest of you, ask those people after what it was like, but it looks absolutely fabulous with some truly astonishing medieval works of art and also some really judiciously selected works of contemporary art. I think it will be the exhibition of the summer, and I say that even with some people from the British Museum here. So, and it also is accompanied by a splendid catalogue that I haven't seen, but that is co-authored by Jessica and her co-organizer and also co-parent of feverish 2-year-old Ed Kirchma. So congratulations to Jessica on this, and book your train tickets to Norwich ASAP. It's a really great pleasure for me to introduce this evening's ICMA lecture. Tonight's event is the 27th in a series established by John Loudon in 1999 in partnership with the International Center for Medieval Art. Based at the Cloisters Museum in New York, the ICMA is a truly remarkable network of medievalists who energetically support research and also the community of researchers around the world. And in fact, the ICMA is one of the sponsors of Jessica's exhibition, for which she is very grateful. If you aren't already a member of the ICMA, I strongly encourage you to join. And I have been provided here with a slide with a QR code that will take you right to their registration page. They publish Jesta, they sponsor sessions at conferences, they sponsor exhibitions and all kinds of things. So it's a really positive community to join. We're also immensely grateful to the generosity of William M. Vokeley, Curator Emeritus of Medieval and Renaissance Manuscripts at the Morgan Library, for sponsoring for a very long time now the Courtauld ICMA lectures. And we're also grateful to Sam Fogg, who is supporting the reception afterwards, and I hope you'll join us for that. Our speaker tonight is William J. Diebold, the J. Neuberger Goodsell Professor of Art History and Humanities Emeritus at Reed College. I first met William, I was recalling with him earlier today, in 2001 when he was visiting London as part of an amazing roving National Endowment for the Humanities seminar led by the scholar Paul Shawnack, which brought a group of kind of early to mid-career scholars to England to look at collections around the country. And I was then an ultra-junior curator in the British Library, and it was my responsibility to supervise a seminar that focused on the Beowulf manuscript, amongst other things. So I think it's fair to say that, William, you're my only friend who I met while showing you the Beowulf manuscript, which is a pretty high point to begin any kind of professional relationship. William has published extensively on early medieval topics, including his book Word and Image, An Introduction to Early Medieval Art, and many articles on Carolingian and Ottonian manuscripts, ivories, and also associated writing about art. His lecture tonight is part of his ongoing research on the modern reception of medieval art, specifically in 20th century Germany. To date, this has led to a variety of publications, including articles entitled The Nazi Middle Ages and Medievalism, as well as a volume of scholarly essays that he co-edited with Brigitte Büttner, Medieval Art, Modern Politics. Published last year, this fascinating volume is an open access publication from De Gruyter, and so I really strongly encourage you to make a note of it and hunt it down. It's a really great read. with many articles and a fantastic introduction. Most recently, his essay on medieval art and architecture as a source of redemption in post-World War II Cologne has been published in the volume Fragments, Medieval Makers, Modern Responses, which was published earlier this year. William's paper tonight is called Judgments in Nuremberg, the 1950s Trade in Medieval Christian and Jewish Manuscripts in the Most German of All Cities. So please join me in welcoming William.
Thanks very much to Alex for that introduction. And I'm honored by the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm grateful to Alex, Jessica Barker, and the Courtauld for the invitation, and also to the ICMA for its financial support. Is the mic volume good? Yeah. Good. Okay. I'd like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of John Loudon, who was a friend, a supporter, and a teacher and scholar who I deeply admired. I didn't realize until very recently that he was also a driving force in establishing the ICMA lecture at the Courtauld. So I'm especially pleased to be able to remember him on this occasion and at this institution. So this talk is centered on these two manuscripts, and in many ways they're an odd pair. For example, a gap of 5 centuries separates their production. But my subject is not their production, but their reception. A reception that, as I'll try to show, was shaped by the political and social context in which it took place. Any historian of medieval art of my generation or later, so that's to say everybody in this room just about, any of you will know that a concern with reception is basic to the discipline of art history as it's now practiced, and discipline of medieval art history. What is somewhat more unusual about this lecture is that the reception I'm going to be presenting took place not during the Middle Ages, but much later, in the middle of the 20th century, in modernity. If reception is key to determining the meaning of a work of medieval art, and I very much believe that it is, then it's important to recognize, I think, that reception's meaning-making effects did not end with the end of the Middle Ages. The meaning of medieval art continues to change as a result of its post-medieval reception. And so to the degree that this lecture has a methodological contribution, it's that we should attend to the full and ongoing history of reception. As my title indicates, the reception in which I'm interested in was in a particular place, the West German city of Nuremberg, and during a compressed space of time. The events I'll be recounting all took place between 1950 and 1957. That narrow geographical and chronological window is for me an advantage, not a drawback. It allows me to tell my story, which is drawn almost exclusively from the archival record. It allows me to tell that story with a detail that I hope can do justice to the rich evidence, and so let us understand the situation quite fully. Now, I worry that may make the topic sound rather worrisomely tedious, so I'll note that Nuremberg in the 1950s was not just any old place. It was a very fraught location, perhaps the most fraught in all of Germany, which itself in that period was a deeply fraught country. Nuremberg had a storied history, including in the visual arts, a history that can be encapsulated in the name Albrecht Dürer. But it was the city's much more recent history, a tumultuous one, that makes it for me a compelling topic. In the decade preceding the events I'll recount, Nuremberg had been an important Nazi center, made famous and infamous by their annual party rallies and massive building projects there. Then, after the war, the city was, not coincidentally, chosen by the victors in the Second World War as the site of a series of trials of the most important Nazi war criminals. Those trials took place between 1946 and 1949. And all this was happening in a city that since the 19th century had been considered both the geographical and spiritual heart of Germany, the city dubbed the most German of all German cities. So I thus feel justified to some degree in using Nuremberg as a kind of microcosm of West Germany. As we shall see in the course of this lecture, many of the major issues of modern German history are linked to the stories of these two medieval manuscripts. Germany in the 1950s was marked by a series of questions that had arisen from the recent experience of the Second World War. Was it possible for the country to continue as a nation? And if it was, how was Germany to deal with the legacy of the Nazis? That legacy included massive physical damage, and this was no more apparent than in Nuremberg, which you see here. Even more problematic was the devastating moral destruction brought on by the Shoah, the Nazi murder of the European Jews. And all of these questions were being faced in a Germany that was now, as a result of the war, divided into two countries, with the border between East and West Germany marking the front line of an undeclared but very real Cold War. I'll suggest that all of these historical conditions bear directly on my story. Here are some additional images of the first manuscript I'm going to discuss. It's the so-called Codex Aureus Epternachensis, the Echternach Gospel Book. In 1955, when it was acquired by Nuremberg's Germanisches Nationalmuseum, it was called the most magnificent and important acquisition since the museum's founding. And the museum had been founded over a century earlier, so that was a quite strong statement to make. For my purposes, the manuscript's history before the 1950s is very quickly summarized. The Codex Aureus actually consists of two parts. The manuscript proper is a gospel book, written and illuminated in the first half of the 11th century at the monastery of Echternach, now in Luxembourg. It was there, we believe, that the book's pages were joined to the gold and ivory cover you see on the left. This cover had been made a few decades earlier, and we know this from the beaten gold reliefs on it, which depict Otto III and his mother Theophanu, which allow us to date the cover quite precisely. After the book and cover were joined, the Codex Aureus remained at Echternach until the monastery was secularized in 1801. It was then acquired by the ducal house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, whose lands were in central Germany. In December of 1953, the Germanic National Museum in Nuremberg, which I'll be generally abbreviating as the GNM, the Germanic National Museum agreed to buy the Codex Aureus. The seller was the current Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Karl Eduard. He was born as Charles Edward as a grandson of Queen Victoria, but then just before the First World War, became head of the ducal house in Germany. The price was 1.2 million marks. In order to assemble that very large sum, the museum pursued two unusual strategies. One was to ask the German federal government for financial assistance. The other strategy was to raise funds by selling off something from the museum's collection. I'm going to discuss both of those strategies and how they played out, because I think they tell us quite a bit about the connection between medieval art and modern German politics. Immediately after settling the price, the director of the GNM, Ludwig Grote, asked the German Interior Ministry for financial help. Director Grote's appeal gives a good sense of the importance he ascribed to the Codex Aureus. He wrote that the crucifixion ivory on the cover is the most important work by the greatest German sculptor of the era, while the manuscript's illuminations are the most magnificent document of Romanesque painting. Together, they make the Codex Aureus a total work of art of the highest order, equally as important for German history, cultural history, and art history. Grote admitted that the price was high, but he thought that the book was worth it so that the museum could fulfill our pan-German mission. With that word, pan-German, Grote signaled that the acquisition of the Codex Aureus was a political event. Recall that in 1954, there was no pan-German political reality. With the defeat of the Nazis, large portions of what had historically been regarded as German had become the territory of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other countries. And within the greatly reduced boundaries of Germany proper, West and East Germany were separate rival states. But by using the word pan-German, Grote reminded the West German government that acquiring the Codex Aureus could serve the national interest. To help convince the federal government to provide financial support, Grote pursued what I believe is a unique strategy. He solicited from leading scholars in Germany expertises, so essentially letters of recommendation for the manuscript. Many of these are preserved, and taken together they allow us to see what a cross-section of the German professoriate thought was important about the Codex Aureus in the winter of 1954. I'll be presenting a summary of that material. The most common argument the professors made was a patriotic one. A federal subvention would keep the Codex Aureus in Germany. That was a real issue because the Metropolitan Museum of Art and perhaps other American institutions had made substantial offers for the manuscript. There was thus a danger that this jewel of medieval manuscript art will be wrenched from the native soil. This line of argument came easily. Academic art history had been born in the 19th century, the great age of nationalism, and nationalism suffused the discipline. Patriotic arguments were especially tempting in the case of the Codex Aureus because the book, and especially its cover, had much to offer to a national art history. This was true for the beaten gold reliefs at the edge, one of which depicts the late 10th century ruler Otto III, as I said. His dynasty, the Etonians, were considered Germany's first kings, and so this was seen as, the cover could be seen as part of the origins of German history. The nationalism that could suffuse the cover was also true of the crucifixion ivory at the cover's center. In the last years of the 19th century, the art historian Wilhelm Furge had attributed this ivory to a distinctive artist, an artist he dubbed the German carver. Although we don't know where this sculptor worked, Furge was certain that he was German to the core. Here's how he characterized the artist's style. Inwardly, it belongs to us. It's one of the few things from the earlier period that speaks a genuine German, that is, so to speak, written in coarse German dialect. It has German rawness and intensity, and also German stubbornness. So that's Furge in 1899. One might have thought that after the defeat of the Nazis, that kind of argument would have been beyond the pale. Yet Hans Kaufmann, the head of the Association of German Art Historians, amplified Furge's thinking when he wrote in his expertise for the Codex Aureus, artistically, the cover is of German blood. Kaufmann's racialized language is exceptional, but elevated patriotism is a leitmotif of the letters. It was sometimes expressed in stark, heartfelt terms. One scholar wrote, "This work may not cross the borders of our fatherland. Everything must be done to stop that. We would be ashamed for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren if we let that happen." The heightened patriotism of the expertises is noteworthy given that in the wake of World War II, German national pride was a tricky subject. The issue was especially complicated in the case of the Codex Aureus because it was a work of Etonian art. The Nazis had considered the Etonians the first German emperors. It was the Etonian First Empire, or First Reich, that was evoked by the Nazis in their Third Reich. And as you may know, several key Etonian-era buildings, notably the church at Quedlinburg, had become Nazi cult sites. So the Etonians were problematic in the period, in my judgment. Nonetheless, the historian Per-Søren Schramm argued for acquiring the Codex Aureus precisely because it was Etonian. Neither France nor England, neither Spain nor Italy has anything comparable to the cultural achievements of the Etonian era. This era was just about the only one where German art was graced to set the standard for Europe. Given how heavily instrumentalized the Etonians had been by the Nazis, this indication of them trod very close to the line of what was acceptable. But it does not take much imaginative effort to understand why calling attention to a high point of German culture from the distant past, why doing that would fulfill a pressing need in the early 1950s. Germany stood accused of the worst crimes in the history of mankind, and so was desperately searching for a usable past. For the professors who wrote the expertises, the Codex Aureus had a key role to play in that search. Thus, one of them argued that the federal government must act because, besides its material worth, the Codex Aureus Rector Nach is among the very rare supreme achievements of German art, the emblems of our historical consciousness, and if I may say so, of German pride. For this art historian, then, it would be a scandal if the book were given away as just one more object for the international collecting fever. The insistence here that the Codex's spiritual value was far greater than its material worth would have had a particular resonance in post-war Germany, because in that period, many Germans insisted that the physical destruction of their country was not in any way a corollary to a concomitant spiritual or cultural destruction. So there was an emphasis on the preservation of the spiritual, even in the wake of the destroyed material. Directed Grote's strategy worked. The German federal government agreed to provide a subvention of 300,000 marks, about a quarter of the price of the Codex Aureus. The individual German states combined to donate the same amount. But the GNM still had to come up with the other half. To do this, Grote, with heavy heart, agreed to sell objects from the museum's collection that are, quote, at the borders of the areas in which we collect, close quote. They decided to sell this painting by the Netherlandish artist Lucas van Leyden. The price the Boston Museum of Fine Arts paid for the Lucas gave the GNM almost all the money necessary to complete the purchase of the Codex Aureus. So I've just described how one illuminated manuscript of the Middle Ages came to Nuremberg in the 1950s. The remainder of this talk is devoted to the circumstances under which several other medieval illuminated manuscripts left the city in the same years. When the board of the GNM met to approve the sale of this painting by Lucas, the meeting was run by the board's chair, Theodor Heuss. Heuss had a second, more prominent position. He was the president of West Germany and had been since the country's founding in 1949. Heuss was thus an informed and extremely experienced politician. At the board meeting, he noted that the museum was also considering selling a few Jewish texts that were in the museum's possession, in particular a 15th century Haggadah manuscript that came from a German Jewish community. However, a transfer for the purpose of the acquisition of the Echternach Codex needs to be examined politically and tactically so that no harm is done. Heuss's reference here is slightly vague, since the GNM actually owned two well-known 15th century German haggadot, the books that contain the texts read during the Passover Seder. What is clear is that Heuss was hesitant about the museum selling Hebrew manuscripts. He did not spell out his political and tactical worries, but they're easy enough to reconstruct. The German president was surely concerned about the optics of a museum devoted to Germanic culture, selling German Jewish manuscripts, and especially to buy a Christian gospel book. In 1954, Heuss's hesitation carried the day. Neither Haggadah was sold. But just 3 years later, the GNM did sell both haggadot. They entered the collection of Zaman Schaken, a German Jew who had made his money as an innovative and successful department store owner. Schaken was deeply interested in books, and his collection of them had a clear focus: German and Jewish culture, and especially their interaction. An acquaintance summed up Schaken's unique collecting interests when he noted that there were larger collections of both German literature on the one hand and Judaica on the other, but there is no second instance of manuscripts by Goethe and an autograph by Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav under the same roof. So the German polymath and the Hasidic rabbi were precise contemporaries. So I think this is a pretty good statement of Schaken's quite interesting symbiotic collecting interest. Schaken left Germany in 1935, sending his books to Jerusalem. He spent the war years there and in the United States. After the war, Schaken's collecting interests changed, and for the obvious reason. The Shoah had destroyed the German-Jewish symbiosis in which Schaken had so deeply believed and which had guided the formation of his library. As a result, Schaken changed the focus of his collection. He no longer wanted material that was German and Jewish. He was interested only in Jewish books, especially Jewish books that were still in Germany. Schaken was therefore very interested in the Nuremberg haggadot, but since his collection was literary, he had little to offer museums such as the GNM in return for them. A third party was required to complete the deal, and one appeared in the form of the Freies Deutsches Hochstift. This is the museum and library devoted to German culture of the Enlightenment and Romanticism that's housed in Goethe's house in Frankfurt. The Hochstift desperately wanted Schachen's extensive collection of literary manuscripts by the German Romantic poet and thinker Novalis. Schachen had virtually all the Novalis manuscripts. The director of the Hochstift proposed a three-way deal. The GNM would sell the haggadot to the Hochstift, which would then trade them to Schachen for his Novalis manuscripts. This plan was ingenious, but not without obstacles. The haggadot were important, well-known manuscripts and had been in the GNM for a century. One of them actually belonged to the founder of the museum. Furthermore, both haggadot were likely made in southern Germany, one of them perhaps in Nuremberg itself. This seemed quite central to the museum's mission, not at all at the borders of the areas in which we collect. Despite these difficulties, the deal took place in 1957. The Freies Deutsches Hochstift purchased the medieval haggadot for 80,000 marks and then traded them to Schachen. The GNM intended to use the funds from the sale of Hebrew manuscripts to buy this piece of 16th century Nuremberg metalwork by Wenzel Jamnitzer. The deal actually never came to fruition, but they intended to do that. So to summarize, the two haggadot had without problem survived the Second World War in Germany and in Nuremberg of all places. But the haggadot could not endure the early years of the German Federal Republic there. That assertion may seem a bit snide, and is a bit snide, but a look at the archival record suggests that it's also fair. The sale of the Hebrew manuscripts was recommended by a subcommittee of the GNM's board. It was a small group comprising Ernst Beutler, who was the director of the Goethe Museum in Frankfurt, and two other museum curators, Ernst Holzinger and Theodor Müller. Their discussion began by laying out the situation as the German Gentile curators saw it. These are from the minutes of the meeting. I'm going to show you the full minutes. The Jews are taking great pains to collect in Israel the documents of their past, to the degree these exist. They should be supported in doing this. By the same token, these documents, to the degree they are also connected to Germany, are also of great importance to the cultural life of the Jews in Germany. So there were, in other words, competing interests at work between Jews in Israel and Jews in Germany. The minutes in the meeting then turned to the position each curator took on the proposed sale. Nonetheless, Dr. Müller unequivocally spoke in favor of the surrender of the haggadot. Dr. Holzinger was also of the opinion that one should accommodate the Jewish requests, if in return something valuable from the German past would enter the museum. Dr. Beutler emphasized the importance of the acquisition of the Novalis manuscripts, which can only be accomplished in this fashion. What's striking to me from these laconic minutes is how clear it is that the medieval Hebrew manuscripts were of little or no interest to these museum men. Beutler had no hesitation about sacrificing them if he could get the Novalis manuscripts in return. The other two curators at least seem to have recognized that selling the haggadot posed a dilemma. But note that the dilemma was for them entirely a Jewish affair, one that involved weighing the interests of Israeli Jews against those of German Jews. Given how few Jews there were in Germany, in 1954 the Jewish population of Nuremberg was about 200, it was not much of a contest between Jews in Israel and Jews in Germany. And so I think it's not surprising that Müller unequivocally spoke in favor of selling the haggadot. For him, this would be a loss to Jews in Germany, but apparently not a loss for any other Germans. Holzinger was even clearer that the haggadot were of no interest. He was perfectly happy to sell them if in return something valuable from the German past, that is the Jamnitzer cup, something valuable from the German past would enter the museum. For him, the two German Jewish haggadot were apparently not valuable German things. Indeed, it seems clear from the minutes that for all of these curators, Jewish manuscripts, even if produced in Germany, had little or no place in the German National Museum. Their logic is clear and familiar. For them, Jew and German were essentially incompatible terms. While that thinking had a tradition in German anti-Semitism going back to the 19th century, it's important to recognize that it was not exclusive to anti-Semites. The German Jew Schachen had, as a result of the Shoah, also come to believe that no symbiosis between Germans and Jews was possible. That was why he was willing to sell his formerly beloved Novalis manuscripts to get the haggadot. If the story of the Nuremberg haggadot were a unicum, it might be dismissed as an oddity, without probative value, but it's not unique. A few years before he acquired the Haggadot, Schocken had obtained this exceptional 14th century Machzor, a prayer book, from another public institution in Nuremberg. The Nuremberg Machzor was even more famous than the city's Haggadot. It had been in the city library of Nuremberg since at least the 17th century, and it may well have been come into the city's possession as early as 1499, when the Jews were expelled from Nuremberg, so extremely long Nuremberg provenance. Nonetheless, in January of 1951, Nuremberg City Council unanimously agreed to sell the Machzor to Schocken for 16,000 marks. Although the city fathers in Nuremberg recognized that the Machzor had scholarly and cultural value, they asserted that since the manuscript exhibits no particular connection to Nuremberg, it could be sold. The proceeds from the sale were then used to replace a section of the library that had more modern materials that had been destroyed in the bombing of Nuremberg during the war. When this Machzor arrived in Israel, Zalman Schocken's son Gideon sent a telegram in Hebrew to his father that read, "The Machzor arrived in excellent condition. Blessed is he who redeems captives." If the first sentence is a simple piece of news, the second is considerably more poignant. In it, Gideon Schocken invokes the Jewish mitzvah known as Pidyon Shvuim, the duty to redeem captives. Usually that mitzvah commands a Jew to go to virtually any length to get back a fellow Jew that is being held prisoner. Here, Gideon Schocken treats the Machzor as if it had been a Jew held captive in Germany, and he asks for a blessing on his father for having redeemed the manuscript and brought it to Zion. The trope of the Jews as people of the book has a long history, but here we see a literalization of that idea. Now the book is the Jew. That idea was resonant in the period after the Shoah. 6 million Jews had been murdered, but books like the Nuremberg Machzor and Haggadot remained. As one scholar has trenchantly put it, the rescued books functioned as a form of embodiment and legacy of the murdered collective. Thus far, I've tried to show that the acquisition of the Codex Aureus and the disposition of the Hebrew manuscripts from Nuremberg were affected by two pressing issues in West Germany in the aftermath of World War II. Could there be a usable German past after the Nazis? And what was to be the relationship between Germans and Jews in the wake of the Shoah? I want to turn now to my second major case. It again takes us to Nuremberg in the early 1950s. But it involves a medieval Christian illuminated manuscript leaving the city rather than entering it. The circumstances are thus reversed, and so I hope that this reversal, which I see as a kind of test case, I hope that this reversal provides a position from which we can evaluate the story I told in the first part of this lecture. Although the move of the second manuscript out of Nuremberg had nothing to do with the Shoah, I'll try to show that its fate was closely tied to two other important legacies of the Second World War: Germany's changed demographics and rising American economic and cultural power. Some of you, many of you perhaps, will know the Church of St. Lorenz in Nuremberg. Perhaps when walking around the church's east end, you'll have admired Adam Kraft's monumental tabernacle. On the pier directly opposite the tabernacle is a comparatively modest bronze plaque. Right there. Show you the detail of it. Shows a man's head in 3/4 profile above a long inscription in German and English. The text cleverly takes advantage of the grammatical possibilities of the two languages, so that the German text ends with the same name, Mr. Rush H. Kress, that opens the English version. So there's the sentence basically ends Mr. Russ H. Kress, which begins the English text below. The inscription tells us that thanks to the generosity of Kress and his brother, St. Lorenz, which had been badly damaged by bombs in 1943, was restored. It also notes that when Kress attended the rededication service of the church in 1952, in token of its gratitude to its donors, this church presented them with the Geese books to be deposited in the Kress Library of the National Gallery of Art in Washington. 2 handwritten illuminated volumes originally donated by Anton Kress, provost of St. Lawrence, from 1504 to 1513. Despite the plaque's prominent location, I don't know how many people have stopped to decipher it. But anyone who did must have found the last sentence pretty puzzling. Geese books. That's the name for this manuscript. It's a gradual, the book that contains the chants that accompany the Christian Mass. The manuscript's unusual name comes from this page. Its marginal miniature shows a choir master wolf leading a flock of geese who chant from a large book of music, while a fox sneaks up on them from behind. This immense, and the book is immense, this immense 2-volume gradual was made for St. Lawrence early in the 16th century. Anton Kress, the church's provost, was involved in its production. Then, 450 years later, in 1952, the geese books were given to the American Rush Press, who, as the plaque recounted, gave them to the National Gallery in Washington, of which he was a major patron. They subsequently, Kress transferred them to the Morgan Library in New York, which is where they are now. August 10, 1952 was chosen for the rededication of St. Lawrence because it was St. Lawrence's feast day. On that day, the church devoted attention to its saintly patron, of course, but it also devoted a lot of attention to another more modern patron, the American 5-and-dime store magnate Kress. In this photograph, taken at the ceremony, Kress is the tall man with white hair, and the manuscript curators among you may want to avert your eyes here, because right next to Kress is the pastor of St. Lawrence, Gerhard Kubel, and he places his finger directly on the famous marginal image that gave the book its name. Along with the geese books, Kress also received a calligraphed document signed by Kubel that reads in part, St. Lawrence Cathedral, badly damaged during the Great War 1943, was helped in its greatest trouble by Mr. Rush Kress. Anton Kress donated 2 valuable Mass books. Since the Reformation, they have remained well guarded in the vestry of St. Lawrence. Now these books shall be presented to the meritorious descendant of this family in the deepest gratitude. This is more or less the same story told on the plaque with which I began. Rush Kress restored St. Lawrence and in return received the geese books. But this document also reveals 2 new and quite crucial pieces of information about the graduate. One is that, since the Reformation, they have remained well guarded. The Reformation came to Nuremberg in 1524, only a little more than a decade after the geese books had been given to the church. Thus, after only a few years of active liturgical life, these spectacular Catholic volumes could only be well guarded at St. Lawrence, since after the Reformation they could no longer be well used there because of liturgical changes. So already by 1525, the geese books had ceased to function as they had been intended. In 1952, this invocation of the Reformation might seem a bit anachronistic. But for Pastor Kubel, a fierce and tireless advocate for his church, the Reformation was definitely very much still alive. St. Lawrence stands at the very right of this post-war image of the center of Nuremberg. It had not been destroyed in the bombing that ravaged the city, as you can see, but it was damaged, especially the roof. And after the war, Kubel was faced with the task of rebuilding. He warned the Protestant authorities in Nuremberg and more generally in Germany that if they did not spend money to maintain St. Lawrence, the Catholics would take control of it and turn it into a Catholic church. That scenario seems fantastic, and I think it was fairly fantastic. Something out of the era of the religious wars, not out of modernity. But in fact, it was modern developments, the Cold War and the division of Germany, that had given a new impetus to Christian interconfessional conflict and made Kubel's fears at least plausible, if not actually realistic. In its pre-World War II borders, the population of Germany was predominantly Protestant, and so was the nation's identity. As the birthplace of Martin Luther, Germany was the cradle of the Reformation. That changed quite dramatically after the Second World War. With the division of Germany, many of the most populous Protestant areas fell to the east of the border, while West Germany included such large Catholic areas as the Rhineland and Bavaria, which is where Nuremberg is located. That demographic shift, confessional demographic shift, was exacerbated by the large-scale migration to West Germany of Catholics from now communist countries in the East, notably Poland. So the population balance between Catholics and Protestants shifted quite dramatically in West Germany. And then finally, with the division of Germany, key Reformation sites, such as Wittenberg or the Wartburg, lay to the east of the border and became inaccessible. So this meant that Nuremberg, with its great Lutheran churches, St. Sebald and St. Florence, could see itself quite reasonably as a Protestant bastion against the new Catholic dominance in West Germany. Given this dire situation, at least as he perceived it, Pastor Kubel must have been delighted when Rush Kress expressed an interest in restoring St. Florence in return for the Geese books. Kress likely became aware of the Geese books from their inclusion in this lavish family history, produced in 1930 at the instigation of one of his brothers. Whether Rush Kress was actually related to Anton Kress, the provost of St. Florence who was involved in the production of the Geese books, whether they were in fact related is far from certain. Kubel, however, was never shy about gilding the lily, and he did not miss a trick in connecting his rich American patron with his 16th century namesake. The second new piece of information in the gift document was this. Now these books shall be presented to the meritorious descendant of this family. In this photograph of the handover of the Geese books, Kubel emphasizes the connection. This time he's got his finger directly on the inside of the Gradual's front cover, where his middle finger touches a book plate that shows Anton Kress. So Rush Kress wanted the Geese books, and St. Florence wanted Kress's money for its restoration. But there was a problem. When Kress asked Pastor Kubel if he could buy the Geese books, he was refused. Kubel told him, "We hold firmly to the position that German cultural property may not be sold abroad." Pastor, however, had a solution. In our judgment, the situation is different when it involves a thank you gift for a man who has obtained very special merit for the reconstruction of the destroyed Church of St. Florence. In Kubel's estimation, Kress's donations to the restorations of St. Florence maintained for the German people a piece of culture that was incomparably more important and valuable than these two volumes. Kubel's primary concerns were parochial in the literal sense, but he was savvy, and he knew that when it came to justifying the sale of the Geese books, it was important to talk about the bigger picture, the national and the international one. He therefore noted that for the 400 years since the Reformation, the manuscripts had sat unused in St. Florence, and nobody paid any attention to them. Now they were in Washington, where they are simultaneously serving German art and the tie between Germany and the United States. We don't think that's a bad thing for Germany. Kress similarly claimed to be serving national interests as well. By restoring St. Florence and receiving the Geese books in return, he was interested in the spiritual and moral development of our children and grandchildren to offset any further encroachment of communism and socialism. I can't really reconstruct his logic here, or it's opaque, but I think it's clear that he imagines that the Geese books and a restored St. Florence are in some way weapons in the West conflict with the Soviet Union. While these statements from Kress and Kubel both seem quite naively optimistic about the power that medieval manuscripts might exercise in the modern world, they do make clear that the prime actors in the transfer of the Geese books from Germany to the United States were operating very much in the spirit of the Cold War. Kress considered his acquisition of the Geese books a win at the spiritual and moral level. The deal was also a financial success. When Kress's German banker sent in the final accounting, which is tallied down to the last pfennig, it revealed that the Kress Foundation had paid just over 1.1 million marks for the restoration of St. Florence. That's almost exactly what the GNM would pay for the Codex Aureus a few years. So it's possible, I think, to see the two manuscripts on which this lecture is focused as having essentially the same value or having been valued the same way at the time. Kress's banker, in this letter to him with the accounting, formally noted that the astonishing part, besides your generosity, is that despite the expenditures, the value of the stocks Kress still held in Germany was higher than it had been in 1949, when Kress first ordered work done in Nuremberg. For this fact, The banker congratulated both the German economic miracle, which was going on at the time, and he also congratulated the divine. This illustrates the effect on the stock exchange of the general recovery of this country during the last 3 years, and it also shows that God does virtually repay what you do for him. So Kress's acquisition of the Geese books did not cost him very much. And this is especially so because he claimed that the books were possibly the most valuable books in the world. And he, in the letter where he says that, he's writing to the director and chief curator of the National Gallery, something. But he bases that claim on the quite naive judgment that because the Geese books were manuscripts and therefore unique, they must be more valuable than any printed book, including the Gutenberg Bible. He noted that there were 7 Gutenberg Bibles in the United States. But it was their contents, really, more than their rarity, that made the Geese books especially important to Kress. According to him, the Geese books were the first criticism of the Roman Catholic Church preceding Martin Luther, and one of our ancestors was interested in the producing of same. That statement puts a lot of weight on this marshal. Surely too much weight. This image does gently mock the clergy, but such anti-clericalism was pretty common currency in the late Middle Ages. Rushcliffe insisted, however, that his Nuremberg namesake Anton was a herald of the Reformation. He reported to the National Gallery in Washington that Anton was both the first officer of the Roman Catholic Church to become a minister of the Protestant Church, and that he was a personal friend of Martin Luther. Neither of those is true. Evidence, at least, that any of them is true. Kress's insistence that the Geese books were proto-Protestant, so Kress himself was a Baptist, had been born a Lutheran, converted to baptism. So Kress's insistence that the Geese books were proto-Protestant is especially ironic when we recall that Pastor Kubel in St. Florence considered that the manuscripts were disposable precisely because they were irredeemably Catholic. Well after the Geese books were gone, there was concern in Germany about their loss. An archivist protested, "It's not acceptable, even for such great services, to give foreigners such important works of German culture that are public property." Precisely in the Nazi era, we had again and again to fight with all our power to keep art and archival treasures from being given away to allegedly deserving party elites. We are dealing here with objects that are the inalienable possession of the general public and thus cannot be taken from them. Comparing St. Florence's gift of the Geese books to Rush Kress with Nazi activities was an extremely strong rhetorical move. In 1950s Germany, there was no stronger possible condemnation than to call something Nazi. But in the context of this lecture, there's something even more striking to me about this protest, and that's its uniqueness. No comparable criticism was ever voiced when the Hebrew manuscripts I talked about in the first part of this lecture left Nuremberg. So what in the end was the result of the various judgments in 1950s Nuremberg about whether to acquire or to give up medieval illuminated manuscripts? Here's the plus side, what Nuremberg gained: a restored St. Florence and a spectacular Etonian manuscript. And here's the minus side, what Nuremberg lost: 3 rare medieval illuminated Hebrew manuscripts, the Geese books, and the Lucas von Leyden. So significant gains, but also significant losses. But note that this is only Nuremberg's balance sheet. There are others that can be drawn up. From my perspective in the United States, the events I've recounted seem a clear win. 2 significant works of European art arrived, and none left. Suppose we broaden the perspective, however, to that of art history in general, and count works entering public collections as a gain, those leaving as a loss. Here the balance sheet is quite mixed. The Codex Aureus moved from private to public, as did the Novalis manuscripts owned by Schocken. But all 3 Hebrew manuscripts, which had been public, became private. 2 of them remain in private hands, while one of the Nuremberg haggadot was subsequently given to the National Museum in Israel. And then the Geese books and the Lucas moved across the Atlantic, but stayed in public collections. While businessmen like Rush Kress and Zalman Schocken would probably approve of drawing up this kind of balance sheet to see who got the better deal, I don't actually think it's a useful way to proceed. As the last several slides have shown, there's not a single balance sheet to be drawn up. Because there are too many interested parties, the transfer of cultural heritage cannot successfully be reduced to a zero-sum game. What if we consider the moral issues rather than the material ones, and focus on just one of the cases I described? Was the Germanisches Nationalmuseum right to sell its haggadot so that it could buy the German cup on the left? That was the position the curator Holtzinger took, a position that it's easy now to criticize, not least because it depends on a common strain of German anti-Semitism that refuses to allow the manuscripts on the right to be called German because they were written for Jews. A few years before the Nuremberg Museum sold its haggadot, a similar situation, a quite similar situation, I believe, involving the proper disposition of Hebrew manuscripts arose in Frankfurt, a different institution. There, a German librarian agreed to sell a rich trove of medieval Hebrew manuscripts to a German Jewish family that had emigrated to the United States. Here was his rationale. These Jewish illuminated manuscripts are not, considering all that's gone on in Germany, really in the right place. The Frankfurt librarian thus staked out a position diametrically opposed to Holtzinger's. He asserted that because of the Shoah, Germany had lost its right to own Jewish culture. For Holtzinger, the Jewish makers of the haggadot were the problem, because they were not, in his mind, German. For this librarian, the situation is reversed. His contemporary fellow Germans are the problem, and the solution is for them to give up their ownership of Jewish culture. It's very tempting to judge this librarian's behavior as right, and Holtzinger's as wrong. But note that the two cases are actually more similar than they first appear. Not only are the results identical, in both cases the Jewish manuscripts were sold, but also that the arguments are essentially the same. They should be sold because they don't belong here. Those identical conclusions were admittedly reached by very different logics, but their fundamental similarities is worrisome, at least to me. And it's worrisome enough that I think it makes it hard to draw firm conclusions about what was the correct behavior here. The problem is that works of art have locations, but they don't have right places to be. Or if they do have right places to be, the works of art themselves don't make the determinations about what those right places are. That doesn't mean that the judgments I discussed, which were all about right and wrong places, don't matter. Ownership, location, and the like can and do have vast effects on reception, including scholarly reception. The Codex Aureus has become more prominent by being in a public collection, while the Nuremberg haggadot are arguably less well known than they were when they were in the GNM. The kind of judgments I presented in this lecture can thus be studied historically, and I believe that they should be. Historical study can describe how and why judgments were made. It cannot, however, decide such questions of judgment. That's, I think, a pretty commonsensical conclusion to a highly empirical lecture, and as such, I think and hope that it might have pleased its dedicatee, John Loudon. Thank you.